Hi, I'm Stevenson, and we'll be looking at Abram in the land of Egypt in our continuing study of the book of Genesis. You remember we saw that Abram had left Ur of the Chaldees. He had gone up to. From there, he had come down into the land of Canaan, and we see him arriving there, but then continuing on. We read in Genesis 12:9, he journeyed on, continuing toward the Negev. Negev means the desert, but it also came to be used as the direction south. But in this case, it's probably talking about the desert. Now, there was a famine. There was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. So he's coming into Canaan, but Canaan is a inhospitable place, not because the Canaanites are so bad at this time in history, but because there's famine in the land. So he goes to a place where the famine would not be so extreme, and that's going to be in Egypt, because Egypt has the Nile River, and even when there's famine in the land, Egypt usually has it pretty good. Now, Egypt in Abram's day had already been there for many hundreds and hundreds of years. In fact, the pyramids, we think of Egypt as the land of the pyramids. The pyramids were already old, hundreds of years old, in Abram's day. They had been built during the Old Kingdom of Egypt. That Old Kingdom had come to a close, things had sort of fallen apart, and then things had come back together, so that now we're not in the Old Kingdom of Egypt, but we're in what historians refer to as the Middle Kingdom. And it's in this Middle Kingdom of Egypt where Abram comes, Genesis chapter 12, verse 11. It came about when he came near to Egypt that he said to Sarai, his wife, "See now, I know that you are a beautiful woman, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife,' and they will kill me, but they will let you live." And so he says, "Please say that you are my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, and that I may live on account of you." Now, what Abram's worried about has a little bit of a precedence in antiquity. There were times when there might be a beautiful wife, and as well as for other reasons, and a powerful man might go and take that wife for himself and then kill the husband. And so he's worried about himself, and he gets his wife to go along with this pretense. It came about when Abram came into Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. Pharaoh's officials saw her and praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. Therefore he treated Abram well for her sake, and gave him sheep and oxen and donkeys and male and female servants and female donkeys, and even camels. Camels were sort of rare in Egypt in that day and age, but they're mentioned here as well. But the Lord struck Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. What Abram did brings plagues upon the house of Pharaoh. Now, what Pharaoh did, he did not do intentionally. He thought he was linking his family with that of Abram. He was treating Abram in a right way. Then Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is this that you have done to me?" Apparently, Pharaoh comes to understand somehow that this is Abram's wife, and that was a no-no, not just in the law, but even in Egyptian culture. And so Pharaoh says, "What is this that you've done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister so that I took her for my wife? Now, then here is your wife. Take her and go." Here we have a pagan ruler, a pagan who's rebuking the man of God. The pagan Pharaoh rightfully rebuking the prophet. Verse 20, Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they escorted him away with his wife and all that belonged to him. Now, we have a contrast here. As we read of the story of Abram in Egypt, remember that the people who are reading this for the first time are the people who have come out of Egypt. Israel, who had been in Egypt, now they've come out of Egypt, and now they're headed for the Promised Land. They're hearing these stories from Moses, and there's a contrast between the two. Abram in Egypt, he and his family had entered Egypt because of a famine in the land. We're going to see at the end of Genesis, when the Israelites go into Egypt, it's because of a famine in the land. Likewise, Abram had been in Egypt. Now Pharaoh had treated Abram well, That hadn't been the case with Israel in Egypt. The Pharaoh had treated Israel harshly. They'd become slaves in the land, and yet God had delivered them. In Abram's case, the Lord strikes Pharaoh and his house with great plagues. And in Israel's case, when Israel goes into the land and he's getting ready to bring them out of the land, the Lord strikes all of Egypt with great plagues as well. Abram in Egypt, Abram leaves Egypt with all of his belongings intact. In fact, the Pharaoh had even given him treasures, and he's allowed to keep those. And likewise, when the Israelites finally leave Egypt, they leave with all their belongings, and they even plunder, that is, they collect sort of back pay from the Egyptians, and they leave with all of their belongings intact. Now, what we're seeing here then is that in Abram we see a microcosm of Israel. What had happened to Abram now also happens in a sense to Israel. As they go into Egypt, they're in Egypt for a time, and they leave Egypt as well. But that's not the end of the story. We come to the New Testament, and we find another one who entered Egypt. You remember the story in Matthew chapter 2. We have Jesus, who's born to Mary, Joseph being the husband, and because of a threat, not because of a famine, he goes down into Egypt to escape, not a famine, but a threat. And they go into Egypt for a time. Now, there's no Pharaoh in Egypt by this time. But then afterwards, they leave Egypt intact, and they find it as a place of safety, so that the words of the prophet, which were intended for Israel, are also true of Jesus. When Hosea chapter 11, verse 1, when Israel was a youth, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. That was true of Israel. In a sense, it was even true of Abram. But it's also true of the better Israel, of Jesus himself. When he was a youth, he was loved by God and came out of Egypt.